All right, welcome back. Today we are going over Seneca's letter to Lucilius, letter 47. This one is a fairly long one on master and slave. All right, so he starts off in verse 1. I am glad to learn through those who come from you that you live on friendly terms with your slaves. This befits a sensible and well-educated man like yourself. They are slaves, people declare. Nay, rather they are men. Slaves, no, comrades. Slaves, no, they are unpretentious friends. Slaves, no, they are our fellow slaves, if one reflects that fortune has equal rights over slaves and free men alike. So this is really interesting, okay, for a couple of reasons. I think a lot of the history that we hear, it almost seems like slavery originated in the United States. Now, obviously, it did not, okay? It did not originate in the New World. But people forget that. Not only do people forget that, but they forget that people actually recognized, some people recognized, that slaves were human beings, right? And Seneca is one of those people. Now, there's a lot of people in that time. And let's talk about where slaves came from in that time, right? Slaves were usually conquered people. That's how it was. Or someone who couldn't pay their debts. They were sold into slavery, and then their children were slaves, and it's like it was kind of a family thing. Like once you became a slave, and there's a lot of conditions in which someone could become a slave, and in other countries people were captured and then sold into slavery, right? So these were sort of the ways that it happened. But anyway, in this verse, what he's saying here is that he's commending Lucilius, obviously, on being on friendly terms with the slaves. And, if you first read that, you're like, okay, that you should just not have slaves. I get it. But in this case, this is how things were during that time. And again, I'm not justifying it, but I'm saying there are various reasons why such a system existed, and a lot of it did have to do with debts and conquering other countries, and there weren't really countries; there were city-states and whatnot, or regions, right? And so he's saying here that all these other people are saying they are slaves. Yeah, people say that, and then he's saying no, they're men. Okay, and then other people are saying they're slaves, and he's saying no, they're comrades, they're friends. Right? Slaves, no, they are unpretentious friends. Slaves, no, there are fellow slaves. Okay, and he's saying that fortune, all right, has equal rights over slaves and free men alike. So what he's saying is that it doesn't matter if you're a slave or a free man. In one sense, the fact that you are a free man instead of a slave, that's fortune. It's not you that caused that. And then also the same fate befalls slaves and free men. Like you're still subject to fortune. In verse 2, he says, that is why I smile at those who think it degrading for a man to dine with a slave. But why should they think it degrading? Is it only because purse-proud etiquette surrounds a householder at his dinner with a mob of standing slaves? The master eats more than he can hold, and with monstrous greed loads his belly until it stretches, and at length ceases to do the work of a belly, so that he is at greater pain to discharge all the food that he was to stuff it down. So he's saying here that, look, people say it's degrading to eat with your slave. And he's like, why do they think that's degrading, right? It's only because they are holding themselves in such high esteem, okay? It's only because these people are proud and they think that they're better than a slave. And that's why they feel like it's a disgrace or degrading to eat with the slaves. And he's saying that the master, he eats more than he can hold. He stuffs himself, right? And so how is eating with a slave degrading when that's what he's doing anyway? Is he doing these things? In verse 3, he says, all this time the poor slaves may not move their lips even to speak. The slightest murmur is repressed by the rod. Even a chance sound, a cough, a sneeze, or hiccup is visited with the lash. There is a grievous penalty for the slightest breach of silence. All night long, they must stand about hungry and dumb. So he's giving the condition of the slave. It's not good, right? Again, as much as some people will paint a good picture of slavery, in most cases, it's not good, right? Now, he's describing the case, obviously not for people like himself and Lucilius who treat their slaves as human beings, but for most of the people that are saying it's degrading to eat with the slave. Well, this is why. Is because they have degraded the slave. They've degraded this human being and made them less than a human. And Seneca doesn't like this. All right. The result of it all is that these slaves, who may not talk in their master's presence, talk about their master. Oh, look at that. But the slaves of former days, who were permitted to converse not only in their master's presence, but actually with him, whose mouths were not stitched up tight, were ready to bare their necks for their master, to bring upon their own heads any danger that threatened him. They spoke at the feast, but kept silence during the torture. So what does this mean? So he's saying actually in the olden days for that time, right? It was the case that slaves were able to talk to their masters, that they weren't treated so poorly as they are now, right? And he's saying that the slaves today who are silenced and beaten with the rod and the lash, they don't talk in their master's presence, but they do talk about their master, right? They don't like him, okay? They might be polite. They might be good, well-behaved, but they don't like him. All right. But he's saying that in the former days, when they weren't just, permitted to talk, but actually to talk with him, to give counsel, to be friends, that they were ready to bare their necks. They were ready to give their life for their master. And then he said, they spoke at the feast, but kept silence during torture. So in the sense that they were able to speak and speak freely, but when it came down to doing the work and bearing the consequences, they didn't say anything. They were able to essentially make the sacrifice, right? They had loyalty, right? And it's interesting when you think about this, right? Again, there's different ways of looking at this, but it's how you're treating people, right? I think this is, it's hard for us to imagine, master and slave, but today, but you think about the people that work for you, if you're a boss or a manager, or think about even just your coworkers, or even just, when you are put into a position of authority, and how you treat the people that are under you. When you have power and someone doesn't have power, how do you treat those people? When you go to a restaurant, how do you treat the waiter? Those are the important things. That's what he's really talking about to us here is that how you treat people does matter. When you treat people inhumanly and you abuse your power, they're going to secretly hate you, right? They might be polite to you, but they're not going to have any kind of loyalty to you. Let's move on. All right, he says here, finally, the saying in allusion to this same high-handed treatment becomes current. As many enemies as you have slaves. They are not enemies when we acquire them, we make them enemies. So what he's saying here is that it's kind of funny that people say as many enemies as you have slaves, and that's because each one of these slaves is an enemy. And he's saying they're not enemies when you have them. It's just you make them enemies by the way you treat them. I shall pass over other cruel and inhumane conduct towards them, for we maltreat them, not as if they were men, but as if they were beasts of burden. When we recline at the banquet, one slave mops up the disgorged food, another crouches beneath the table and gathers up leftovers of the tipsy guests. Okay, so he's again saying that most people are mistreating slaves. They're just treating them as beasts of burden, not as human beings. Another carves the priceless game birds with unerring strokes and skilled hand. He cuts choice morsels along the breast or the rump. Hapless fellow, to live only for the purpose of cutting fat capons correctly, unless indeed the other man is still more unhappy than he who teaches this art for pleasure's sake, rather than he who learns it because he must. So, he's given another example of a slave that just lives to cut the bird. That's what he does. And he's saying that, that's quite an unhappy way to live, as that's the only thing you live for. Unless, of course, there's another man that's more unhappy, and it's the guy who's teaching it for pleasure's sake, rather than the person who learns it because he must learn it. Right? In verse 7, he says, another who serves the wine must dress like a woman and wrestle with his advancing years. He cannot get away from his boyhood. He is dragged back to it. And though he has already acquired a soldier's figure, he is kept beardless by having his hair smoothed away or plucked out by the roots. And he must remain awake throughout the night, dividing his time between his master's drunkenness and his lust. In the chamber, he must be a man. At the feast, a boy. So he's just describing another way in which a role of a slave that they have is. And you can see how this is degrading to a person and how this could make a person not be loyal or be upset, not feeling like they really want what's best for the person creating this unusual punishment for them. Or it's not really punishment, it's supposed to be punishment, but it is this role, right? So we'll move on here because not too much of this applies to us. Another whose duty it is to put a valuation on the guest must stick to his task, poor fellow, and watch to see whose flattery and whose immodesty, whether of appetite or of language, is to get them an invitation for tomorrow. Think also of the poor purveyors of food, who note their master's tastes with delicate skill, who know what special flavors will sharpen their appetite, what will please their eyes, what new combinations will rouse their cloyed stomachs, what food will excite their loathing through sheer satiety, and what will stir them to hunger on that particular day. With slaves like these, the master cannot bear to dine. He would think it beneath his dignity to associate with his slave at the same table. Heaven forbid. But how many masters is he creating in these very men? So what he's saying here, and kind of the whole point of this whole segment, is he's saying that, look, when you treat slaves like this, it's no wonder that you wouldn't want to dine with them, that you wouldn't want to treat them as equals, or it would be degrading because you're not treating them. Like, would you want to dine with someone who you're putting through this? Of course not. It would be embarrassing to you, right? It'd be like, if you got on the phone with a customer service representative, right, and you chewed them out, were just totally mean and disrespectful to them, and then you went to I don't know, you went to some kind of dinner or something, and you just happened to sit next to them, right? It would be pretty embarrassing, right? You'd be like, you would be embarrassed, right? Because you treat this person this way, and here they are now in a different setting, right? So that's what he's saying. He's saying the reason why they don't want to actually have dinner with them is because it's embarrassing to them because they've treated them so badly, right? So how many masters is he creating in these very men? I have seen standing in line before the doors of Callistus, the former masters of Callistus. I have seen the master himself shut out while others were welcome. The master who once fastened the for sale ticket on Callistus and put him in the market along with good-for-nothing slaves, but he has been paid off by that slave who was shuffled into the first lot of those on whom the crier practices his lungs. The slave, too, in his turn, has cut his name from the list and, in turn, has adjudged him unfit to enter his house. The master sold Callistus, but how much has Callistus made his master pay for? Right, so let's look at the footnote on this one. I think this one might be interesting. The master of Callistus, before he became the favorite of Caligula, is unknown. So what he's saying here, okay, is, and I don't know all the history behind this, but he's first started off by saying about how many masters is creating in these very men, right? And he's saying that he has stood in line before the door of Callistus, okay? So this guy, Callistus, the former master of Callistus, before the door of Callistus, the former master of Callistus. Okay, so he's seen the master himself shut out while others were welcome. So he's saying that we don't know who this master is, but the former person who owned Callistus, okay, who is now this famous guy, okay, or has some power, that guy got shut out. All right. The same guy who once put a for sale ticket on Callistus and put him on the market, right? Who basically sold him. But now this slave has rejected him, has made him, and he's become the master essentially. Okay, and so it's turned around, right? So this guy, obviously, if he respected the person who he was the slave for, Callistus, then he would have welcomed the guy who treated him well. But in this case, he shuns him. He makes him pay for what he done. And it's not even a very high price, but he embarrasses him is what he does. He dishonors him. In verse 10, he says, kindly remember that he whom you call a slave sprang from the same stock. is smiled upon by the same skies, and on equal terms with yourself breathes, lives, and dies. It is just as possible for you to see in him a freeborn man as for him to see in you a slave. As a result of the massacre in Marius's day, which we'll look at this, there's some doubt whether we should read Verania, as Lippus suggests. This method of qualifying for a senator suits the empire better than the Republic. Verania would refer to the defeat of Varus in Germany. Okay, that doesn't give me a whole lot here, but as a result of the massacre in Marius's day, many a man of distinguished birth who was taking the first steps towards senatorial rank by service in the army was humbled by fortune, one becoming a shepherd, another a caretaker of a country cottage. Despise then, if you dare, those whose estate you may at any time descend, even when you're despising them. Okay, so what he's saying here is this, okay? He's saying that, look, what you call a slave today, they came from the same place as you, all right? They're smiled upon by the same skies, all right? They're on equal terms with yourself. They breathe, they live, they die in those terms, okay? And it's just as possible for you to see a freeborn man in him as him to see you as a slave, okay? And he's saying that what happened, I guess there was some kind of uprising or something, of this massacre. There were plenty of men that were high up of distinguished birth, okay? And we're taking the first steps towards becoming senators and service in the army, and they're humbled by fortune. One guy becomes a shepherd, another a caretaker of a country cottage, okay? And so he's saying, look, despise if you dare, okay, those whose estate, whose position at any time you may descend to, even when you're despising them. So if you despise slaves and you despise people that are lower than you, okay, and this isn't just slaves, it's just people that are lower than you, then do it at your own risk if you dare, because you may be there someday. You might laugh at the waiter and be like, look at this dumb buffoon, can't even get a real job, and then you become the waiter. Okay, that's what he's saying. I do not wish to involve myself in too large a question and to discuss the treatment of slaves towards whom we Romans are excessively haughty, cruel, and insulting. But this is the kernel of my advice. Treat your inferiors as you would be treated by your betters. And as often as you reflect how much power you have over a slave, remember that your master has just as much power over you. So this is really the heart of what Seneca is saying here. And this is so important. Okay? He's saying, yeah, I'm not going to keep on going into how the Romans treat the slaves poorly. But this is what I'm telling you. Treat your inferiors as you would be treated by your betters. What does that mean? That means that, like, treat the people beneath you as you would want to be treated by the people above you. Okay? And then as often as you reflect how much power you have over a slave, okay? So how much power you have over people that are below you, remember that your master has just as much power over you. Now, you might not think you have a master, but you do. There are people in authority. There are people that are over you that have more power than you, and they have just as much power over you as you have over the people that you consider to be lesser. So when you keep that in mind, it will restrain your actions. You will not treat someone with less dignity than you yourself would want to be treated with. And that is very, very important, because someday the tables may turn. And the tables already turn in some aspect. Like, there are people that are over you. All right, so he says here, but I have no master, you say. You're still young. Perhaps you will have one. Do you not know what age Hecuba entered captivity, or Croesus, or the mother of Darius, or Plato, or Diogenes? Okay, so he's saying, look, you might become a slave. You know, a lot of these great men did. A lot of these people were sold into slavery at an older age. They pissed off the wrong person. Okay, but this is true for you as well. You might be like, yeah, I have a good job. I don't have any money problems. Yeah, you might end up working at 7-Eleven. You don't know. Okay, you don't know. You might have to. You know, there's a lot of things that can happen in this world. So, you know, don't assume that nothing bad will happen to you. Associate with your slave on kindly, even affable terms. Let him talk with you, plan with you, live with you. I know that at this point, all the exquisites will cry out against me in a body. They will say, there is nothing more debasing, more disgraceful than this. But these are the very persons whom I sometimes surprise kissing the hands of other men's slaves. So you could see what kind of guy Seneca is here, right? I mean, Seneca's a good guy. He gets it, right? He's like, look, I don't care. I don't care what other people think. Like you treat these people well. You treat a person that is helping you, that is serving you well. And you might argue and say, well, why doesn't he just free the slaves? And okay, I can understand that argument, but at the same time, you know, there's a lot of circumstances involved in this, and a lot of things have to do with the debts and money and things like that. And again, I'm not trying to make excuses for slavery. Like obviously, slavery itself is bad and inhumane, but at the same time, these are the situations that they were living in, and he's saying to treat this person as someone who is just part of your household, that just is on equal terms as you, that is like your family, right? And I think that is a great way to be. If you think about it, it may be a better opportunity for someone to be in service of someone this kind and this hospitable than to actually even be on their own, right? And someone should be able to make that choice. I agree on that point. However, what he's saying is definitely much better than the way that people were treating other people and slaves at this time. And he's saying that he even kisses the hands of other men's slaves. He surprises the hell out of people. Imagine that, right? So Seneca's a stand-up guy, right? He says here, do you not even see this? How our ancestors removed from masters everything invidious, and from the slaves everything insulting. They called the masters father of the household, and the slaves members of the household, a custom which still holds in mind. They established a holiday on which masters and slaves should eat together, not as the only day for this custom, but as an obligatory on that day in any case. They allowed the slaves to attain honors in the household and to pronounce judgment. They held that a household was a miniature commonwealth. Okay, so here's something that's really interesting, right? When you read this, because you don't really hear about slavery, you don't hear about things in this context, right? This last line, he says, they allowed the slaves to attain honors in the household and to pronounce judgment, and they held that a household was a miniature commonwealth. So what does it mean to be a miniature commonwealth? So what he's saying in this case is that they essentially made a household into almost like a little nation, right? and so when you think about it in these terms, right, it's almost like you have a leader of a nation, of a country, and then you have the people that are the citizens of that country. And that's how they treated the slaves in that case, as if they were a citizen of that country. And it's the same. You could say that in the country that you're living in right now, that you're a slave to the government. I mean, you have to pay the taxes, you have to give the money, you have to follow the rules, you have to do certain things, right? You have to do some things compulsorily, right? So do I agree with that? Not necessarily, but I'm just saying that it is a similar type of thing. And when you think about it that way, what he's suggesting doesn't seem so bad. Again, I'm not proposing that slavery is a good thing, but I'm just saying that it's more... that's what it was more designed to be until it got perverted, at least, at that time. Right? And again, like I said, we don't need to get into all the historical things about slavery and where it came from and why it existed in those times. But what he's saying is that, here, look, the ancestors, right, their ancestors, they remove all of this kind of enmity between the master and the slave, right? They called the master the father of the household, the slaves a member of the household. So it was more like a family, okay? And he said that there was a holiday where they should eat together. But he's saying that it's not just on that day, okay? He's saying that it was just obligatory in that day. You had to do it on that day, but it should just be a lot of the time, right? And so this is what he's comparing. He's saying, like, it wasn't always the way that it is now, right? He's saying in verse 15, he says, do you mean to say, comes the retort, that I must seat all my slaves at my own table? No, not any more than that you should invite all free men to it. You're mistaken if you think that I would bar from my table certain slaves whose duties are more humble, as for example, yonder muleteer or yonder herdsman. I propose to value them according to their character, not according to their duties. Each man acquires his character for himself, but accident assigns his duties. Invite some to your table because they deserve the honor, and others that they may come to deserve it. For if there is any slavish quality in them as a result of their low associations, it will be shaken off by intercourse with men of gentler breeding. Okay, so there's a lot of wisdom in this as well, beyond just what he's saying. So the first question is, like, should I seat all the slaves at my table? And he's saying, no, look, I'm actually telling you to treat them like humans. And if you were just treating them like humans, like people, you wouldn't just say, okay, well, you're a slave, so I'm going to eat with all my slaves. That's not it. You would invite certain people just like you'd invite anyone to dinner, right? And a lot of the way that you would choose this would be based on the person's character, not on their position. So even a lowly slave who does a job that's not very honorable, you would recognize that, look, his duties, like what he's become, that was assigned by accident, that he didn't have control over that, right? And so it's the same thing with people, right? When you associate with a certain person, you should look at their character, not what their job is, or not how much money they have. And he's saying this, which is even more important, is he's saying, look, when you decide who to invite, you should invite some people because they deserve the honor, right? You should be friends with some people because they deserve the honor. On the other hand, you should associate with some people so that they may become to deserve it. What does that mean? He says that, if you treat someone well, you may have them have higher aspiration for themselves and actually guide them in that direction. And he says here, if they have any slavish quality, right? So in them as a result of their low associations, okay, so the wrong people they hang around with, or the lower people they hang out with, it's going to be shaken from them with the intercourse of men of gentler breeding. So by taking someone who maybe hasn't had the opportunities that you have had and had the life that you had, and inviting them into your pack, like think about it this way. Let's suppose that you have a group of friends that are super successful. Let's say you guys are making a lot of money. You're doing really well. You're executives, whatever it is. I don't know. Or you're investors, you're entrepreneurs. Maybe invite someone to go on a hike with you, or to go on a dinner with you, or an excursion with you, or something who is not, who's a good character of person, but is working a regular job, is not making the money that you are, is not, came from a lower place than you. And by being around you guys, right, you're going to improve that person's life greatly, because that person is going to absorb those things, and you're giving that person an opportunity. So that's what he's saying. And I think that's very important, right? And some people have done that for me in my life. I've gotten to hang with people that were above me because they're like, oh, I like this guy, right? So I think that's really valuable. He says here, you need not, my dear Lucilius, hunt for friends only in the forum or in the Senate house. If you're careful and attentive, you'll find them at home also. Good material often stands idle for want of an artist. Make the experiment and you will find it so. And he is a fool who, when purchasing a horse, does not consider the animal's points, but merely his saddle and bridle. So he is doubly a fool who values a man for his clothes or from his rank, which is indeed only a robe that clothes us. So again, he's saying basically the same thing that we just talked about. Don't just try to get your friends from high places. Look at the character, right? If you looked at a horse and you just looked at what the bridle and saddle looked like, you would be a fool. You need to consider the actual animal's points, right? And he's saying that the same thing. If you judge a man by his clothes or his rank, that's ridiculous. You're a fool, because that's only a robe that closes. It's only something that it's not actually you. It's just something that you're presenting. He is a slave. His soul, however, may be that of a free man. He is a slave, but shall that stand in his way? Show me a man who is not a slave, one who is a slave to lust, another to greed, another to ambition, and all men are slaves to fear. I will name you an ex-consul who is a slave to an old hag, a millionaire who is a slave to a serving maid. I will show you youths of the noblest birth in serfdom into pantomime players. No servitude is more disgraceful than that which is self-imposed. So he's saying, if you try to argue, well, he's a slave, so are you. So is every man. Everyone's a slave to something. What are you a slave to, right? I can show you you can name any person, and I can show you what they are a slave to. You should therefore not be deferred by those finicky persons from showing yourself to your slaves as an affable person and not proudly superior to them. They ought to respect you rather than fear you. And this is very important. And I talk about this a lot in my podcast, with my wife called Better Than Perfect. If you guys are interested in that podcast, we do a weekly podcast on relationships. And I talk about a man leading and being a leader. And one of the main things that I talk about, one of the points I take about in terms of leadership, is the idea that, in order to lead, to be an authority as a man, right, you need to lead by example, but you need to lead through respect rather than fear. Right. And this is just true in general, right? You can dominate people and make them fear you. And that's not necessarily a good thing. They will listen to you out of fear, but you can win their minds, but not their hearts. It's better to win hearts and minds. And you do that where people respect you, not they fear you. Right. So having people fear you is not the same. It might look the same at the surface, but that the person will be secretly colluding against you. They will be resenting you. Okay. In verse 18, he says, "Some may maintain that I am now offering the liberty cap to slaves in general and toppling down lords from their high estate because I bid slaves respect their masters instead of fearing them. They say, this is what he plainly means. Slaves are to pay respect as if they were clients or early morning callers. Anyone who holds this opinion forgets that what is enough for a god cannot be too little for a master. Respect means love, and love and fear cannot be mingled." So he's got some high words here to talk about here. So he says here, okay, look, some people are going to say that I'm now offering this liberty cap to slaves in general and toppling the lords from the high estate, okay? Because he's saying that I bid slaves respect their masters instead of fearing them. Because I'm saying that slaves should respect their master. And he's saying that because you should treat a slave in such a way that they would respect you instead of fearing them, right? He's not saying that. It might be confusing to say that you think he's preaching to slaves. He's not preaching to slaves, right? When he says, because I bid slaves respect their masters instead of fearing them, he's saying that because I'm telling masters that they should operate out of respect and not fear. And then he says, and then they say, this is what they're saying, that what he really means is this, that slaves are to pay respect as if they were clients or early morning callers. So he's saying that people are saying that what he means is that these slaves, they should now be treated like they're just a client or just a normal person. That's ridiculous, right? That's what he's saying that they're saying. And he's actually saying, okay, fine. Anyone if you hold this opinion, this is what you're forgetting, okay? Is that what's enough for God cannot be too little for a master, right? So what is, does a God, do you respect a God or do you fear God? No, some people do fear God, but he's saying that you're still at your own free will to decide, right? God doesn't make you do something. It gives you the choice, right? So what he's saying here is also respect means love. Respect means love, and love and fear cannot be mingled. So he's saying that if someone respects you, they love you. If a slave respects the master, they love the master, okay? And so you can't have fear and love. If someone fears you, they do not love you. And this is important, right? This is important for religion as well, if you think about this, right? So that's why fear is never the answer, right? You create respect through mutual love, right? By treating someone right. Okay. In verse 19, he says, "So I hold that you are entirely right in not wishing to be feared by your slaves, and in lashing them merely with the tongue. Only dumb animals need the thong. That which annoys us does not necessarily injure us, but we're driven into wild rage by our luxurious lives, so that whatever does not answer our whims arouses our anger." So what he's saying here is that, look, you are entirely right in not wishing to be feared by your slaves. So if you don't want to be feared by your slaves, that's right, okay? Lashing them with merely the tongue is the right way. Like, just if someone screws up, just tell them, okay? You don't need to beat them. That's what he's saying, all right? And then he goes on to say, that which annoys us does not necessarily injure us. So something can annoy you and it doesn't necessarily injure you, okay? But we're driven into wild rage by our luxurious lives, okay? So whatever does not answer our whims arouses our anger. So what annoys us doesn't injure us. But when we have these luxurious lives where we expect all these things, then when a slave coughs at the dinner table, oh, we're so mad, right? Like, how dare you? That's what he's saying. He's like, when you are propping yourself up with such luxury, then these small things are going to make you fly off the handle. Okay? He says, we don the temper of kings, for they, too, forgetful alike of their own strength and of other men's weakness, grow white-hot with rage as if they had received an injury when they are entirely protected from danger of such injury by their exalted station. They are not unaware that this is true, but by finding fault, they seize upon opportunities to do harm. They insist they have received injuries in order that they may inflict them. So he's saying, don't be like this, like these bad kings or tyrants who nothing is going to harm them. They're perfectly safe, but they act injured, right? They act so insulted. How dare you? How dare you stand in my presence? How dare you say that? And then they're only using this in order to inflict injuries because they want to harm people, because they want an excuse for doing that, right? In verse 21, he says, I do not wish to delay you longer, for you need no exhortation. This, among other things, is a mark of good character. It forms its own judgment and abides by them. But badness is fickle and frequently changing, not for the better, but for something different. Farewell. So finally, he wraps up the letter. This is a fairly long one. And he says that you don't need to know this, but yeah, I mean, I trust that you know this already. And this, among other things, is a mark of good character. Okay. And here's what it is. It forms its own judgment and abides by them. So a person of good character forms their own judgments and then lives by them. Okay. But badness is fickle and frequently changing. So if you're constantly changing, it's probably not good, right? Not for the better, but for something different, right? And so this is just interesting. I think this whole thing, because you think about how long ago this was written, and you think about how people didn't really listen to Seneca, right? You think about slavery, like modern day slavery, where it departed from this so much, right? Like what happened to the people? Even you think about some of the forefathers of this country, of the United States. A lot of these people had Seneca's writings, right? I mean, I certainly, if you look at a lot of the founders of the country, of the United States, I'm talking about. We know that they read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, that they held these books. So did they not read Seneca's letters? Did they not agree with Seneca? Did they, and again, I can't pass a complete judgment on everyone. I don't know how they acted, but we have heard some stories, and yeah, maybe some people in the new country treated their slaves well, and because they listened to what Seneca had to say. But it is interesting. It is interesting that even back then, right, that there was this thought, right? Because I think that sometimes historically we look at it and we're like, oh, well, people didn't even treat slaves as humans. They didn't even think of them as humans. And while that's somewhat true, some people did. And some people did understand that. And so it's not like it just is a modern thing. This conviction existed 2,000 years ago, right? So yeah. So I guess part of that is to say that when people make excuses and say, well, that's just how it was, people were already thinking 2,000 years ago that, hey, maybe you shouldn't be treating slaves as if they're not humans. Maybe you shouldn't be acting this way. So anyway, this is a good one, and a lot of wisdom in here. I'll see you tomorrow.